Probably most of the clubs in the Premier League are making extensive use of certainly the events data, but I bet they're not all making full use of the tracking data, for example. They're quite interactive. You can put filters in place, parameters in place to allow you to tweak the data depending on certain situations, and also drill down into the data. Goalkeepers, for example, some of the stuff you could get around movement from some of that joint tracking data could be really, really important. Most people who've held their data on a hard drive at some point would have lost that. Access that data automatically, put that all together, turn that into a formula that was useful, and then visualize that in Tableau. We're working with event data, we're working with tracking data, we're supporting kind of in-game as well as post-game as well. So naturally there's a little bit more resource there to support that. They're not just data collection experts sat there just working through stuff. They are people who worked in football who have really good understanding of football. It's a never-ending task, I would say, in terms of maintaining that data quality. It's something we pride ourselves on being one of the best in the business, if not the best in the business in terms of our data quality as well. So.
Hello and welcome back to the podcast, and today's guest is Rob Suddaby. So Rob is currently Football Data Insights Analyst at FIFA, so a really interesting role there. And before his time at FIFA, he worked at both Leicester and Norwich in their football analytics departments. So Rob has quite an interesting journey to get to where he is now. So he actually started out as an accountant. So he was an accountant for many years. He then became a financial analyst before deciding that he wanted to pursue a career in sports analytics instead. So in this conversation, we speak a little about Rob's journey to get to where he is today. We speak about some of the tools that he uses now in his day-to-day role and what he's used in the past. We learn a little bit more about FIFA and the team that he works with there. So lots to learn here from Rob. So a really interesting conversation. So before we get into the conversation, I would like you to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really does mean a lot, and consider giving the video a like if you do find value. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation with Rob Suddaby. Rob, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm all good, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Excited to get going.
Yeah, definitely. I'm interested to talk to you. You're an accountant turned finance analyst turned football analyst, and from what I can tell, there's a smothering of a little bit of rugby analysis in there, as in the mix, which I'm sure will come through as well. So, and this has been a long time coming. So happy to finally chat with you, Rob. So, I'll do what I always do. So I'm going to pass it over to you. For those that don't know who you are, Rob, who are you and what you're currently doing within sports?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, hey everyone. So my name is Rob Suddaby. I'm currently a Football Data and Insights Analyst at FIFA. I've been working here with FIFA since 3.5 years now, so since the beginning of 2021, not long after the project got started. Previously, I was a recruitment data analyst at Norwich City, and before that, I was first team data analyst for Leicester City on a part-time basis, supporting them. But as you say, my background is in the finance. I was a qualified accountant, and it's technically elapsed now many years ago. But I studied finance when I was younger. I worked for Vodafone for 8 years as an accountant, and then kind of moved into more analysis. So my path kind of moved from normal accountancy to actually doing people's accounts for them, to working as an accountant within a company, and then moving more into the analysis side. And then from there, that kind of naturally continued through. So I worked in business intelligence for a little while at Vodafone, and then as more of a commercial analyst. And then after I left there, I started working more kind of on the data side, starting to think about different tools you could use. That's where I first kind of came across tools like Tableau, Power BI, for example. Then decided I'd had enough of finance and wanted to move into sports. So very briefly was enrolled on the Sports Performance Analysis Masters at Middlesex University back in 2015, that would be, so a long time ago. But I quite quickly kind of realized that actually it wasn't necessarily so much the video analysis side and the kind of performance analysis that was most interesting to me. It was more the kind of analytics side and kind of using software to support on analysis. So I then moved to a company called the Information Lab, where they taught me how to use tools like Tableau and Alteryx and Secret in a lot more detail. I worked alongside Brian Prestige there, who is now obviously heading up the analysis side at City Football Group, and he was able to help me with a role at Leicester City. So I supported them on a part-time basis alongside my other job at the time, and then that led to a position at Norwich City, and then onto FIFA, and here we are now.
Nice, perfect. It's interesting because obviously I've had other people on this podcast, and they all come from, you have your traditional analysts that come from the sports background. We've had economics, we've had physics, we've had computer science, and now we've got the finance baggbackground. So really interesting because there's people that watch this that want to get into it that are in them other industries. So I think it's good for people to see that it is possible if you make it your goal to to make that change. So in terms of that change, Rob, I mean, what I want to ask about, how old are you when you decide, and when and why did you want to move to sport? Because at that point, because you mentioned you did the Masters, which and that came with a bit of a work experience with the rugby club, which we'll talk about. But
Yeah.
at that point, you're kind of going into a new industry where I'm sure that's filled with people much younger than yourself. So how was, and that's no disrespect, Rob, but what were you feeling at the time? Because it's probably a bit of uncertainty there, going from what seems like a very established career to think, actually, this is not for me. I want to work in sport.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think you're spot on there. So yeah, so as I say, it was 2015 when I made the change. So I was in my early 30s by then. I was at a relatively seniorish level at Vodafone, and I was, it's fair to say I was doing quite well for myself. But I got to the point where I just wasn't enjoying that kind of corporate life in the office anymore. It was becoming difficult to get up in the mornings and go into the office. And I wanted something I could really get stuck into a bit more and just kind of enjoy, really. How it all started was I came across a girl called Hannah Thomas on Twitter. I think it would have been on Twitter, I think, at the time, who had been at Middlesex University. I think at the time she'd been on a placement, I think, at QPR. As part of Middlesex University, and she just got a job at Manchester City. So she was writing, she'd written a blog post for the Video Analyst, I think, for Rob Carroll, just kind of detailing some experiences. So I can't remember exactly what it was. I'm sure she was working for like ASOS or something as a stock analyst at the time.
Yeah.
Apologies, Hannah, if you're listening and I've got that wrong. But yeah, she wrote a blog about how she'd kind of, similar to me, she wanted to move into something that she found more interesting. And she come across the Masters at Middlesex University, and obviously from that I've gone on to work for QPR and then on to Manchester City. And I think after a couple of years she moved on to the LTA, if I remember rightly. I haven't seen her for a fair few years, but I believe she was working there. And that just kind of sparked something in me to think, actually, that was something I potentially could do. I was very lucky at the time. My girlfriend at the time, my now wife, was very supportive at the time. We were living together in her small flat. And so she helped support me for a little bit whilst I kind of made that transition. Definitely without that wouldn't have been possible. But yeah, I went along to go and meet the guys at Middlesex University at one of their open days and thought, yeah, this sounded like something I really wanted to do. That then opened up some opportunities for internships. Obviously, being a master's, you kind of work alongside, which was good because obviously one of the big problems moving from outside of sports into the sporting environment is I don't have a huge amount of contacts. But they were really good, and they suggested London Scottish Rugby Club, who are Championship, so second tier rugby club based in southwest London. I was living in North London, so it's a little bit far from where I was living. But I thought, well, to be fair, I knew nothing about rugby at the time. In fact, I'd probably say I actively disliked rugby.
That's what I was gonna ask you that. Anyway, but that's interesting.
No, I didn't know a huge amount about it, but I thought I'd go along, meet the guys there. Had a good chat with them, and I got quite a good feeling. One of the things that was I found quite interesting was the head coach there was at the time was a guy called Peter Richards. For people who are fans of England rugby, he played for England in the World Cup final in 2007 over in France, and there was quite a kind of senior setup there. We had another guy, Tim, who was one of the coaches who'd won the Heineken Cup a few times, I think, and it felt like an opportunity that was quite interesting because a lot of the football clubs were obviously offering, generally kind of under 9s, under 16s, so kind of very, early foundation years opportunities, filming 1 day a week. This was kind of giving me an opportunity to go into the training ground a couple of days a week, go do some filming. So there was a lot of basic tasks there, but go filming, be around the players, be around people who've played at the top level in rugby. And yeah, kind of despite not knowing anything about rugby, I thought actually that would be quite a good opportunity and potentially give me something different. And to be fair, I was with them for about 6 months before, as I say, I kind of decided not to continue with the Masters. But they were great. I learned a lot there. I mean, filming, I don't think I'd ever used a camcorder before that. The matches were filmed, as I'm sure they are now, for us, but we would do some training footage, so you got used to using the various different equipment, setting up microphones, for example, towers, getting in there with a handy cam in the in scrum training, things like that. So yeah, it was a really good opportunity to kind of understand a little bit more about what goes on. And to be fair, that's always kind of stood me in really good stead in some of the roles I've moved into. As whilst a lot of the people I work with, you're quite right in saying they generally are a lot younger than me. And generally, a lot of them will have had a bit more direct experience of doing that kind of analyst role. So in the team at FIFA I've got now, we've got a couple of guys who worked at Swansea City before in the academy, and in the first team, we've got guys who've worked at Stoke City before, for example. We've got a couple of guys who've done some work within Cardiff University as well. So they've all kind of got a bit more hands-on experience. Obviously, Tom Gardner, who leads our team, he was head of analysis at Everton for a while as well. So we've got a lot of that kind of experience. So it's kind of helped me in that respect. But as I said, I kind of then very quickly realised actually it was more the analytics side. It was but you have to remember it was quite new at the time, outside really of baseball. This was really kind of the time when you're starting to see the Opta conference start in, Ted Knutson started blogging, StatsBomb kind of started off. So I kind of came in a little bit after the start of that, in fairness. Kind of around the time that Sam Jackson, Tom Warville, for example, was starting to blog. So there was a bit of a scene going on at the time. As I say, a lot of them were based in London, so we were able to meet up occasionally down the pub and say some of the Opta conferences. So I kind of got to know some of those guys, and that kind of, as I say, took me in a slightly different direction to the information lab, as I say, to start learning some of those skills and try and ideally find an opportunity within football. The information lab had a few football club clients at the time, so it was kind of calculated risk, I guess, in some respects. But I figured, again, a bit like with the Rugby Cup, I kind of figured I would try and take that opportunity to do something a little bit different. I'm always kind of conscious that my background is a little bit different to others, so I'm always trying to think about ways that I can try and use my skills to better do that. There are people who will have far better skills in terms of the analysis world and actually working with players, for example, but I kind of wanted to use some of those skills I had before, really. It still continues to this day in terms of being obviously a bit older. We've got a guy on my team, Harvey, who I think I legitimately could be his dad. He's that young, but such is life. Such is life these days.
Interesting. So in terms of them skills that you mentioned, Rob, so what I'm just trying to think of, like, what transferable skills you might have from your accounting days even to what you maybe use now. I'm sure obviously first thing that would come to mind would be kind of working with numbers, but I'm sure there's other things that you might think that you learned in your previous career that are valuable to you now. So I wonder if you could talk on that a little bit.
Yeah, 100%. Obviously, the numbers thing is certainly prevalent, but look, my last role at Vodafone, which was kind of 10 years ago now, I worked for the last couple of years in the European finance team at the head office. So they were responsible essentially for dealing with the finances of all of Vodafone's European operations. And so the head of our team was the European chief finance officer. He reported up into essentially into the CFO of Vodafone itself. So he was a very senior guy. We were dealing with a lot of numbers, a lot of complex bits of information, and our job essentially, particularly my job, was to distill all the messages from our 8 to 12 different operating companies they had in that Europe region, and try and distill those into key messages for the chief financial officer. Anything you kind of do with data and football and sports is pretty much the same, right? It's about trying to take those key pieces of information and how do you then communicate that upwards to people who are not necessarily going to not understand, but who are not going to want to get into all the detail and the nitty gritty of everything. They just want to understand, right, what are the key things that we're looking for here? And it's exactly the same now when we're doing match analysis in tournaments. We're trying to succinctly present the key information to the different stakeholders, whether that's going to the members of the technical study group at FIFA, or whether that's going to reporting for content generation, for example, or whether that's going to Arsene Wenger and people like that. It's always about trying to find those key messages and get that point across in the most appropriate way. So a lot of things to be able to bring across from that industry, for sure.
Okay, so I hope you're enjoying the video so far, but I have a really quick interruption for anybody with an interest in video analysis. So if that's you, please do click the link down below the video for InPlay Online. So just to give a quick overview, because I think it'll be relevant to a lot of people that are watching this particular video. So InPlay Online is a cloud-based video analysis software. So it allows you to tag your videos, and when you've done your tagging, that includes adding labels, adding comments, adding notes and voice notes even, and you can even illustrate and draw over your clip. So if you are an aspiring analyst looking for your job and you want to create a portfolio of work, if you're a scout looking to make your kind of reports a little bit better and more animated, if you're a coach looking to get into analysis a little bit more, then this tool will be great for you because it starts at just £15 a month. So once you've done your analysis, you can add all the clips to different playlists, which can be downloaded and exported offline. You can put them into presentations and also share them to different people within your team. So it comes with a whole bunch of other features, but I'll let you click the link down below if you are interested. As I say, packages start at just £15 a month, so it's a very affordable solution if you are looking for something to help with your video analysis. So that's it for the interruption. Let's get back to the video. Definitely. So then let's focus on the role of, say, a data analyst in a team. Or I know you're not in a football, like in a club setting, but you have experience of that. So I just wanted to ask you your opinion on what is the purpose of the role of a data analyst within a team. What kind of things would they typically be required to do in a, say, in a football club setting?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, as you say, obviously I'm not in that environment at the moment. I haven't been for a few years, but I wouldn't say it would have changed a huge amount. I mean, the predominant part of my role at both Leicester and Norwich was actually just accessing the data.
Yeah.
It's something I'm sure we'll touch on a little bit shortly. But just being able to access the data was quite a big part of the job at the time, and I would imagine for most clubs at the moment is a very similar case. Sure, your Manchester Cities, your Arsenal, your Liverpools, etc., have got teams of people now who will make sure that's kind of taken care of. But for the vast majority of clubs, accessing data is still quite a big part. So at Norwich City, for example, yeah, first thing I would do on a Monday morning when I get in is run my various scripts, workflows, whatever you want to call them, various tools that would basically access the event data, transform that into what we want, and then output that so we could use that for the basis of our analysis. So that was a big part of the role at the time. But for me, again, it's similar to what I touched on just now. It's about, I think, using the data to help people make more informed decisions. So at Leicester City, I was predominantly supporting the likes of Andy Blake on the match analysis side. So it was helping them look at the key data points from previous weekend's matches, upcoming opponents. So again, I built some dashboards there, for example, to try and help them try and use that data that they had from Opta at the time to try and help them make better decisions.
Yeah.
I supported the sports science team there as well, so we would use some of the physical data that came out from the tracking data to try and help them start to get a bit of a grasp of how far different players were running, what the sprint stuff were. And again, this is nearly 10 years ago now, so 8 years ago now. So things will obviously have moved on a little bit in terms of people's understanding, but at the time, there weren't huge amounts of data around. The players didn't always wear the GPS units back then. In fact, probably not that many did, to be fair, 8 years or so ago. So again, trying to help them with whatever we could to try and help them make better informed decisions. And again, same at Norwich City when I moved there, I was more supporting on the recruitment side. And again, it was really trying to use the data to help the recruitment team, whether that's profile players, so help find them new players, whether that is validate some of the existing players that their scouts have found, for example. But again, it's just around trying to support people. So I think that's really the key role of any data analyst is one is overarching theme there is try to help make informed decisions. Mm-hmm. And you kind of do that by supporting the expert. So whoever is the technical expert in that area. So, from a recruiting perspective, that's obviously generally going to be a scout. In match analysis, that's going to be the coaching side. At FIFA now, those are the kind of technical experts we have with them. So try and help support what they're seeing, and then also try and suggest from what the data show as well. So what can you find in the data that perhaps they've not been able to see? That may support what they see, it may not support them, and that leads to tougher communication when it's not necessarily supporting what they're seeing. But again, can you find things that they maybe haven't thought of as well to try and support? So I think ultimately that's generally the role of most data analysts within sports at the moment. But there's still a lot of things. Analysts always talk about being the ones who are asked to help support on computer stuff. Anytime someone's got an issue with an iPad or whatever, you can imagine for data analysts it kind of takes it up another stage as well. But yeah, I think that again we'll touch on it, I'm sure, but that kind of role of the data engineer is becoming really important in terms of trying to data, for most data analysts, it's going to be their job to start pulling all that information together. And that could be quite a challenge in and of itself, just trying to access and store all the information that you want to use as well.
Yeah, well, that actually leads me to the next point, Rob, I was going to ask you. So in terms of like a data department, we've mentioned data analyst is obviously a role. You said there data engineer, there's data scientist. Like what other roles could potentially, if you were to build a data team within a football club, let's say you're picking out which personnel you would want, what would you include and what are the main differences between them so people can understand like what is the difference between an analyst and an engineer, for example?
Yeah, sure. So for me, there's probably the three key roles at the moment are the data engineer, as I touched on just now, data scientist, and then a data analyst. Now, I mean, ultimately they can be the same role. In many places they are the same role, but for me, there's kind of a couple of distinctions there. So your data engineer is generally going to be responsible for your data environment. So how you're accessing your information, how are you processing that information, excuse me, how are you storing that information? As I say, for a long time when I was at Leicester and Norwich, that data sat in a CSV on my desktop on a hard drive, because it was so big we couldn't, we didn't have anywhere else to put it essentially, so we just kind of stored it there. You can imagine, obviously, in big corporations, you obviously can't have that situation, but again, in football, that's still outside of the top level, that's still relatively a new kind of thing. So yeah, data engineers is responsible for really sorting out, making sure that everyone else has got the tools that they need essentially to work with that. Data scientists and data analysts are much more similar. For me, a data scientist is, a data scientist is just a term somebody came up with, to be fair. But for me, a data scientist is mostly someone who has more of a background in mathematics, economics, computer science, where they've actually been taught the theory behind some of these things, behind kind of how to do predictive analysis, for example, how to do proper statistical analysis. They're people who've been educated in that, and obviously, and generally speaking, will have been educated in using the tools to do that as well. A data analyst, then, for me, is, again, it can be that, but it's probably someone who's more at the coalface. So it's kind of that link between the data engineer, the data scientist, and your technical experts. So again, whether that's coaches, scouts, whoever, it's kind of more that person who links those two areas together. So they have an understanding of how to store data, how to process data, but aren't experts on it. They have an understanding of predictive models, of how to do basic statistical analysis, but perhaps not the regimented focus on how to do that. But they maybe have more kind of skills in terms of better understanding of the actual situation. So, I would very much place myself as data analyst. I can access data through different methods, whether that's through API calls, whether that's through downloading data, how to do those kind of ETL jobs, that extract, transform, and load, and how to store data. But I don't keep up to date on the best ways to do that, because it's ever changing as data gets bigger and better. And I'm probably not the most efficient as well. I don't have years of experience of doing that. Likewise, on data science, I have an understanding of some of these principles, but I never studied economics. I never studied computer science. So, I don't know necessarily all the theoretical ways to do things properly. So I can do them, and I can give them a go, but would they be super robust? Are they going to do what you're looking for them to do? Maybe not. But I kind of understand how to apply some of that data. So one of the things that was really key to me coming from an accountancy background in football is the need to be recognised as knowing what I'm doing, if that makes sense, that kind of legitimacy. And so one of the things I first tried to look at when I started was doing my coaching badges. It's taken me a long time, but earlier this year I finished my UEFA B licence. And so as part of that, I've been able to spend a bit of time coaching on the field, think about setting coaching plans and kind of how to work with players. And that's kind of helped me a little bit in better understand how to work with those actual practitioners on the pitch, for example, which I think is quite important. So I kind of leverage that for myself as part of that data analyst role. And so my role at FIFA, for example, is exactly that, is liaising with the technical experts, liaising with the performance analysts, but also working really closely with our data science team, our data engineering team. They are ultimately responsible for gathering the data and making sure it's safe and it's where we need it. I'm then responsible for trying to turn that into insights, as the job title suggests, and trying to help analyze. So yeah, I think does that make sense in terms of those kind of three distinctions?
Yeah, definitely, and we're going to touch a bit more later on in terms of that role at FIFA that you've got. One thing you did say there, Rob, which you said, like, as the data gets bigger and better in terms of the amount of data, I presume you were speaking about there. I just feel like clubs they have access to a lot of data, and a lot of clubs don't really, they don't have the personnel to be able to get the most from that data. Because I even think it's been a long time, say for me, like since I worked in that club setting, it's been kind of 10 years or whatever. And even back then there was quite a lot of data, but we didn't really have like a data scientist or, like they weren't existing. And it's good that obviously teams are now bringing them in, but it always seems like they're kind of catching up, like, because even now there's stuff where people are talking about, like skeletal data and different biomechanical data, but then the clubs just don't really, the top ones will, but a lot of the clubs just don't have the people in-house which will be able to actually work with that data. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There is, as you say, there is so much data available these days. And some clubs are luckier than others. Some clubs get it provided for them. Some clubs will be buying it. Some clubs will be borrowing it when necessary. We know in the Premier League they have access as part of the Premier League deal to event data, to tracking data. So probably most of the clubs in the Premier League are making extensive use of certainly the events data, but I bet they're not all making full use of the tracking data, for example, still. Once you get outside of the Premier League is very difficult. Most of the leagues outside of kind of the top 5 leagues across Europe don't necessarily have tracking data. Some of the clubs might pay to have the cameras installed in their stadium. Some might have them as leftovers from being in higher leagues, for example, but not everyone will. But it's it's getting more and more. In our senior FIFA competitions now, we have obviously semi-automated offside. We'll be seeing that again in Premier League certainly soon. I think quite a few of the clubs a few of the leagues around Europe have implemented that this year as well. So there's more and more data, and in order to do that, they're using joint tracking data, which means joint tracking data now exists as well. So there's an extra thing for people to use. But I think the key thing has always been for me is no matter what you've got access to, it's trying to make the most of that. So, if you're an Arsenal or Manchester City and you've got those people, you can probably spend the time trying to marry up the event and the tracking data and try and find what you can get from that. And you're probably now starting to think about the joint tracking data and how you can use that from a biomechanical standpoint. Maybe from performance analysis, maybe is limited in terms of the usages for it, but certainly from a sports science perspective, the opportunities are endless. Or if you think for goalkeepers, for example, some of the stuff you could get around movement from some of that joint tracking data could be really, really important. But as I say, I think the key thing is no matter what you've got, you're trying to use it to your absolute best. It's something, for example, when I was at Norwich City, I think as a club they were really, really good at. And limited resources. We were in the Premier League for a time whilst I was there, but certainly not one of the richer clubs. But they were very, very good at focusing on what data would be useful, finding that data, and then making as much use of that as you could. So I think that's probably the key thing. But the data is getting ever bigger, and as I say, it costs a lot of money to store some of this data as well, and that's money that often clubs don't necessarily see the value in. If you can spend money on something that's useful, a useful part for your training facility or on a player, that's probably going to sound better than, I'm just going to move this data from my hard drive onto the cloud, but it's going to cost you 10 times as much. It's difficult. I think it's still a difficult sell. I may be wrong. That may have changed in a lot of clubs these days, but I would imagine it probably is very similar. Yeah.
Just on the sports science side of things as well, Rob, I think for people that are looking to trying to get into it, there's loads of teams and I mean low teams, even non-league teams that they wear the GPS vest, but they don't have, they don't do anything with the data. They're just kind of more so wearing it. So if you want to get experience, you could probably go to teams like that they are collecting it because they've got the wearables, but they just don't do anything with it. I'm sure there's value to be added there. So so if you've made it this far into the video, you must be enjoying the content. Either that or you have simply fallen asleep. So whichever one of them it is, you probably won't mind me asking you for a quick favour. So as you know, I'm always looking to grow the channel. So the bigger the channel gets, the more people we can reach and impact, but also the bigger and better guests we can invite onto the channel to have these types of chats. So with that in mind, if you haven't already done so, I would very much appreciate it if you did hit the subscribe button down below the video. The stats are showing around 25% of viewers are subscribed. So there's a big chunk of you that are watching the videos, but you haven't yet hit the subscribe button, but I will let you off because you can do it right now. It's free and it literally takes 1 second. So if you go down, click the subscribe button, it would mean a lot to the channel and help the channel to grow. So that's all for now. Let's get back to the video. What we'll do, Rob, is we'll jump to, touch upon a little bit, but the roles at Leicester and Norwich. So we'll just kind of jump into them if we can. So Leicester was first. So I'm just going off your LinkedIn profile as well here, Rob. So you say you're supporting the head of performance analysis and sports science. And in there was some kind of automation of tasks. So I was wondering if you can just kind of expand on that a little bit in terms of what that entailed, really.
Yeah, of course. So when I joined, they had, as I say, obviously as Premier League club, they had access. So I joined Leicester City the year after they won the league. Sadly, I missed out on the season before. I just got the difficult first 6 months. But no, Leicester was a fantastic club. Always looking to do smart things. Obviously, they had Andy Blake and Peter Clark had both been there for a long time. Andy's recently moved on. Peter had moved on to the FA, but I think is back there again now. We have Matt Edge with us there as well. And they were keen to try and use the data that they had for free from the Premier League to try and help with some of their processes. So some of the work there that I did would be trying to help automate some of the tasks that the guys had. So, for example, could we pull out all of the times for when shots took place in matches so that the video guys would be able to go and find those a little bit easier? Yeah. So there are simple tasks like that, but some of the automation was just how rather than using the CSV or the Excel files that Opta provided at the time, how could we actually leverage all of the information that you got if you downloaded the data through their API? And how could we then start interrogating that data ourselves? So how could we then start creating our own calculations our own metrics that would help understand performance and really kind of focus on what Leicester City were interested in as well. So that was part of it. And then again, as I touched on earlier, some of that was about trying to access and automate reporting around the kind of distance, the physical and distance metrics that they were receiving every week. So previously they might get the Excel files, somebody would combine those files in Excel and try and put together some kind of simple report. I used at the time, it was Alteryx, for example, to access those that data automatically, put that all together, turn that into a formula that was useful, and then visualize that in Tableau at the time for them to present them over a little report each week. So it was relatively basic information, but just in those first few weeks, they straight away got a better gauge of what they were seeing. And most of the time, the data wasn't telling them anything they didn't know, but maybe it was just validating what they thought, and maybe there were a few things that they didn't see. If I remember rightly, Shinji Okazaki, who was, might have got his name on there, who was with the club at the time, was just starting to move more towards kind of impact players. He was coming off the bench a lot more, and his physical numbers were off the charts for when he'd come on for short periods of time. He'd be putting in high speed runs equivalent to some midfielders who were playing the entire match. So kind of gave them a little bit of information around that, and some of the older players, helped them a little bit manage their schedules. I think, again, you touched on it just now, the teams have that GPS data from training, but oftentimes they then don't have the match data. So again, trying to help them marry up some of the data they had from training during the week with the data they're getting from match day to try and give them a bit more of an all-round picture. Yeah. The physical space is interesting. I think it's probably one that's still quite heavily underutilized. I think a lot of it often falls on the sports science team, who won't necessarily always have those skills in place. They're much more kind of around strength and conditioning side, physio side, maybe not necessarily the data side. So I think it's something they always are interested in support. But I think it's an area that's got a lot of potential opportunities in future, as we say, especially with joint tracking data.
Yeah, definitely. So then Norwich was seemingly more to do with kind of the player recruitment side of things, which typically, if a club invests in data, it seems to be that's where they kind of push a lot of the focus, because it can lead to probably seemingly bigger results in terms of bringing players in and doing better. So recently I actually had Sam Radford on here, who is a data analyst at Norwich now. So you were there sort of 3 or 4 years ago. So I'll link that one down below for anyone that wants to see that. But just curious to ask a little bit what you did at Norwich, Rob, around that kind of recruitment side of thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, Sam came in, I think, a little while after I had left, but I'm sure he's following some of the same kind of stuff. So yeah, as I mentioned before, Norwich, a very smart club. They were, at the time, the performance analysis and recruitment team was headed up by Lee Dunn, who's now the head of recruitment at Norwich. I've been very lucky at the 2 clubs I worked at. They both were genuinely really good clubs to work at. The people there were excellent. And what you find at both of those clubs is there's a lot of people there who've been there for a long time. Yeah. Maybe that's the case at some other clubs as well, but I often find that's a really good indication of a successful club. And Lee has been there for, I don't know, at least since I'd say probably 10 to 15 years, I'd say, across all. So I'd got things set up in a really, really good way. I came in to take over from Alex Klein, who at the time had moved to Southampton. I think he's now at Manchester United. So he was, if I remember rightly, more using tools like R, for example, and SQL to work with stuff. And when he moved on, there was a bit of a skills gap there. So again, being in the Championship at the time, now obviously I joined them the season, would have been 18-19, so the season they got promoted under Daniel Farke. I think it's probably safe to say at the start of that season that wasn't necessarily expectation that we're going to get promoted. I think there was a hope, but certainly not to run away with the league in the way that they did. Yeah. And so they were looking to try and use similar tools, Tableau and Alteryx, that it would be a little bit more available to everyone in terms of understanding. So my job there was to try and take the scouting data, so Scout 7 database as it was then, to try and pull out that kind of qualitative information from the scouts, so around scouting reports, and then marry that up with some of the performance data that we would get from Opta as it was at the time. So try and put together, help really with in terms of the player profiles that were being put together for head of recruitment at the time, Kieran Scott, and for sporting director, Stuart Webber, and the manager. So how we could kind of feed into that to try and improve that process, but also how could we use data to try and continue trying to help find players. At the time they'd had the success with Emi Buendia, for example, who was always seen as a very big data signing. I think Mariella Nesataki was one of the ones who helped bring me into Norwich. I think she's was heavily involved in that. She's discussed a few times that before on various different podcasts. I think is not necessarily as heavily data focused as people think. I think he showed very well in the data, but it was a real triumph of targeted video scouting at the time as well. Something that Liam Henshaw touched on in your podcast last week as well recently. So it's to try and see what we could do. So for example, could we use something as simple as minutes played data to try and find young players playing at a high level across Europe? So that doesn't mean they're playing for Inter Milan or for Juventus, but are they playing week in, week out at, say, an FC Copenhagen or at a second Bundesliga top team? Could you find players, young players who are playing a lot of minutes? Because generally, if you're playing a young player a lot, they're probably fairly decent. So again, a fairly simple hypothesis, but could we go and use that to highlight certain players that we could then ask the regional scouts to then go and look at? Eight or 9 times out of 10, they're already aware of these players. They've already seen them. But again, it's trying to help them make those more informed decisions. Maybe they've noticed a player a few times, but when you're looking after 3 different leagues and there's maybe 12 to 20 clubs in each league, they don't always necessarily pick out every single one. So maybe there's something there we can help them understand in terms of how can we, like I say, how can we leverage that really simple data to help them go and be a bit more targeted. So yeah, that was a big kind of chunk of what I did there. Naturally, that kind of led to using the data for match analysis purposes as well. So repurposing kind of some of the stuff like I did at Leicester City previously to try and support the team. So again, trying to help automate things like pre and post match reports. They could be, again, created using a tool like Alteryx, visualizing Tableau, and rather than that taking someone a couple of hours every Sunday to put together, maybe it takes 20 minutes for one person to put together and could be sent out as well. So again, just supporting the team there where I could as well. So yeah, that was kind of the main part of the role there.
Yeah, perfect. So I want to ask you about some of the tools you use then, Rob. You mentioned the Alteryx has come up, Tableau's come up. So we'll start with Tableau. So again, this is more so for maybe people listening that might not be familiar with each of these tools, and also for me, I don't use these tools day in, day out. So firstly, Tableau, and what I want you to do, if you can, Rob, just kind of what it's used for, maybe some benefits of it, and maybe if there's any downsides to it, and then we'll kind of go through, we'll do Tableau, then Alteryx as well, because I've never used that before. So just curious to get your thoughts on the different tools, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was trained specifically on Tableau, Alteryx, and kind of SQL language when I was at the information lab. So those were the predominant tools that I kind of then took with me around. So yeah, I mean, most people will be aware of Tableau. It's predominantly a data visualization tool, but it can be used for various different things. So the intention of it is to allow visual analysis. So rather than trying to work through a table of numbers, creating simple charts to try and help analyze data. That could just be for yourself. You could just literally, rather than trying to read through a spreadsheet of data, you could put that into a visualization tool like Tableau, put it on a bar chart, and straight away the eyes can see, right, okay, this number is bigger than this number, so on and so forth. So that's kind of the main idea of Tableau. It can be used to create quite complex dashboards. I think the really nice feature about Tableau and tools like Power BI, for example, over what would have been creating graphs in Excel, creating graphs in PowerPoint that lots of people do, or Keynote, is that you can drill down into the data as well. So they're quite interactive. You can put filters in place, parameters in place to allow you to tweak the data depending on certain situations, and also drill down into the data. So drilling down is not something you'd use necessarily so much in sports, but for example, when I was in finance, okay, let's say I wanted to look at the sales for a week, and I can see they're quite high. I can click in, I can drill down to that data and maybe see it by day, and see maybe there was a big spike in one of the days. I can drill down into that day, go and look at that. Maybe it's a shop that's got 5 different stores. I can see it's one store and they made a couple of really big sales in that day. Yeah. That's something that previously could take somebody unlimited hours to find. Essentially you're having to look through the data. You might get lucky and spot it straight away, but it might take you a couple of days to find. The idea of visual analysis is so that you can try and find those insights really quickly. You can then, as I say, create these dashboards. And Tableau, for example, has a kind of server platform or a cloud platform so that you can then host these reports so other people can look at it. So when I worked more in the business side of things, when I was consulting with different companies, often we were creating dashboards, hosting them online, and then trying to kind of create a self-service analytics platform for people to be able to use. But it's generally a fairly intuitive tool to use, relatively quick to pick up. Difficult to master, I would say, but getting the basics is relatively easy. But ultimately, I think it's just one of a number of tools. A lot of it is about trying to understand the principles of data visualization. So when and how you should use it, what different chart types should be used in different situations. That's a skill maybe that's still lacking, I think, at the moment. There's lots of people getting good experience with tools like Tableau Power BI, and again, even Excel, PowerPoint, etc. They're all perfectly good tools, but again, I think it's about trying to understand the principles of visual analysis, what I say, when to use different chart types, how to present information. Within FIFA, we occasionally use Tableau to help with some of our graphics creation for external content as well. And again, it's just a useful tool in terms of trying to put that stuff together. But again, you really need to understand what the basics are so that you know how to present your message in the best way. But no, it's a really powerful tool. I generally use it for most of my analysis. So if I'm looking through a match, for example, and I want to find some of the key metrics, personally, I would still stick the data into Tableau and look at it that way, just because it's how I've kind of evolved over the last kind of 10 years of using it. Many other people will be able to chuck stuff into, or just look in Excel, for example, and be able to look through it. And yes, whatever works for people. But I find that a really interesting and easy way to look at data.
So would kind of Tableau and Power BI be kind of a one or the other, or would there be a reason why you would use one over the other for certain things?
Generally, you would only use one, only really because they do the same thing. I don't personally know how to use Power BI to a great standard, whereas Tableau, I mean, they're very much, much just when you know one, you kind of know the other one is just kind of learning the vagaries of how to work it. I think the advantage of Power BI, for example, is a lot of companies use Microsoft products, they use a Microsoft platform, Excel, Outlook, etc. Power BI often comes bundled with those tools as well. And so you're able to get access to that generally for free in a lot of organizations, whereas Tableau, for example, it's not hugely expensive, but it's another cost. So again, if you're working in a place with limited resources, it can be quite challenging to get that. And then with Tableau, particularly if you then want to upscale that to allow other users to be able to host that, then obviously adds additional costs on top of that as well. So again, can be a something that stops people from being able to roll that out to a greater size.
And where does Alteryx fit in then, Rob? What is that, and what do you use that for?
Yeah, so Alteryx is a little bit like Tableau in that it's kind of got a drag and drop interface. So again, it's supposed to be made to be quite intuitive. The way I would describe Alteryx really is basically as a kind of ETL tool. So extract, transform, and load. So it's really a data transformation tool. You don't really need to know any coding skills. You don't need to understand how to use R or Python or computer programming. The average kind of layman, again, can learn some of the vagaries. But essentially, if you want to input data, you drag a tool onto the workflow, point it to where the data is. If you want to remove some fields, you put another tool in and you untick the fields you want. If you want to pivot the data, you put another tool, and so on and so forth. And so it's a really good way to be able to transform data. So whereas before people would be going into Excel and maybe manually transforming that data, you've now got a tool that can bring in ultimately an infinite number of Excel files, for example, or it can access a database. It can access various different data sources and treat them the same and transform to how you want it to be, and then export that data to a CSV into can push it into a SQL database. It can push out a JSON file, a Python file, whatever you want. So again, it's a really, really powerful tool for people who, again, don't need a huge amount of coding experience and that computer programming side of things, but also, again, within a day or two, you can be really getting to grips with it, which I'd say probably is not necessarily the case for tools like Python and R. Sometimes they require a little bit of a little bit more technical understanding in terms of how things work. So again, it's a really, really powerful tool, but ultimately it's very, very expensive as well. When you think Python and R are essentially free tools, Alteryx is in the several £1,000s a year kind of bracket. So it can be quite expensive. The benefits are huge, but it can be quite an expensive tool. So again, when you're in certain situations, it can be quite difficult to justify those costs. And I'd say increasingly so with the kind of more prevalence of tools like Python and R.
Yeah, definitely. So quick one on then kind of databasing as well, Rob. You mentioned earlier in terms of like back in the day, you might just have all the data stored on a hard drive and stuff like that. How important of a skill is being able to, build and store and upkeep these databases? And is that a job that typically an analyst would do, or would that be an engineer's kind of job, or is it just a useful skill for people to have in general?
Yeah, definitely. I'd say it's absolutely a useful skill to have in general in terms of being able to use databases. More so these days, that is a SQL database. In the old days, that could have been like a Microsoft Access database, for example. I don't think it exists anymore, but for people who've used that before, it's one way of doing it. But yeah, definitely. So the benefits are, there's a few benefits. One is you're not storing stuff on your hard drive. It's stored somewhere, hopefully remotely, so that people can access it. And if someone robs your hard drive or your laptop, you don't lose everything. But yeah, no, it's a really good skill to have. You can host your data in there. I say it's secure. It's then people can access it. You can also interrogate. So SQL is a query language essentially, for example. So you can actually then go and query that data as well. So you might take your Opta data, for example, you might transform it into something you want and then host that in a SQL database. You might then think, actually, I want to go and create some new metrics, or I want to go and filter data for certain players. You can go into a SQL front end. There are plenty of those free around. You got, for example, one at the moment called DuckDB that's becoming quite common. That's quite a fast SQL user interface. But you can go in there, write some query language. Again, you need to know a little bit of the syntax, but it's not really computer programming so much as more just thinking more like a computer in some respects. Just thinking, this is the information I want to select. I want to filter it where this condition is met, and this is where my data is stored. But again, with a few lines of code, let's say, you can start to extract some really good information. So it's definitely a really good tool to learn. I think increasingly these days people are switching on to the fact they need to host their data. Most people who've held their data on a hard drive at some point would have lost that. Everyone has it, whether it's video, data, etc., and inevitably that leads to discussion. So I would hope that these days most people are, and most sporting environments are using databases to store their data. So again, it's a really useful tool to have. And again, you can find people whose entire job it is to use SQL to a really high degree. But I think if you can just understand some of the basics, then it's a really positive way to be able to access data and to be able to start creating stuff. And it's also a really good stepping stone in terms of then moving on to more like computer programming languages like R, like Python, for example. Because as I say, I wouldn't necessarily say SQL is like that, but again, it's similar. You are writing, you are typing out instructions for a computer in terms of how to work. So it's a really good stepping stone for people in that respect.
Perfect. So let's jump now to FIFA then, Rob. Obviously, that's where you are at the moment. So I understand you can't tell us everything in terms of the secrets and stuff behind there, but we'll try and get as much out of you as we can. So, firstly, in terms of the department of analytics at FIFA, like what does that look like, Rob? In terms of how many people are in there? Like, are you overseeing them as well? How does that look?
No. So I mean, when I talked earlier in terms of that kind of ideal setup of having data analysts, data scientists, data engineers, we are very fortunate to have a really outstanding team of people set up there. So we have a couple of data engineers, a couple of data scientists, and a couple of data analysts as well. So it's a reasonable sized team, but we've got people kind of specialized across the different areas to be able to access the data. So we're working with event data, we're working with tracking data, we're supporting kind of in-game as well as post-game as well. So naturally there's a little bit more resource there to support that. So we're really fortunate to have some really good, really intelligent guys there. Both of our data scientists are doctors, for example. So again, it goes back to what I mentioned before. They've got that really good theoretical understanding and really good practical application of data in kind of real world scenarios before they came across into the football world. So we're really lucky there to have some really good people and some good resource put into that. It really helps us get that environment into a really good position. And like for myself personally, as and when I might move on, so I've now got a much better understanding for myself of what a really good environment should look like and kind of how to apply that elsewhere.
So you mentioned earlier, I think you kind of part of your job is to liaise with the non-technical people as well. So like, who do you report to then, Rob? Who's your boss, but who also is the people that you are delivering these messages to? Who you're speaking to the most, really?
Yeah, sure. So I report to a guy called Harry Lowe. He's the head of football performance analysis. He reports up into Tom Gardner, who's the head of football performance insights. As mentioned, Tom was previously at Everton as head of the analysis team. Harry was previously at Swansea City and also with the Chinese national team just at the start of COVID, which was a great time to be involved with the Chinese Football Association, as you can imagine. They're both really good guys. So my role is predominantly the link between kind of our data science team and then kind of the technical experts. So, when we've got tournaments on, so we've just finished a couple of tournaments. We had the Women's Under-20 World Cup, for example, that was won by North Korea a few weeks ago, just finished. And we've got the Women's Under-17 World Cup starts in Dominican Republic next week, middle of October as well. So we'll be supporting the technical experts who are on site out there. I'm not sure who they're going to be at this stage, but they will generally be former footballers, former players, former coaches. So got a really good technical understanding of the game. So they will go and watch matches. Very similar setup if you've seen a Champions League for example, with UEFA. They call them technical observers, excuse me, but essentially they'll be people who've worked in football before with a really good technical understanding, who can make observations based on what they see in the game. We will try to marry that up with what we see in the data. As I say, it doesn't necessarily always work. Sometimes you do find things that don't necessarily back up what they're seeing on the pitch, but we're trying to support their observations, and then also try and use the data to try and find trends, for example. So, what is a particular trend we've seen? So a really good example from a FIFA perspective is, if you were to go back and look at the 2010 World Cup or the 2014 World Cup, you're probably not going to find centre backs, carrying the ball out. I'm a big Arsenal fan. We bought Ricardo Calafiori in recently. He's quite happy carrying the ball pretty much from one end of the pitch to the other. You're probably not going to find those kind of trends back in the day. But these days, increasingly, it's very common that you'll see centre backs, full backs, for example, very comfortable on the ball, goalkeepers, for example, as well. So, we're trying to find those kind of trends within tournaments as well. So sometimes that's looking back against the previous tournament to try and see are there changes in how it's developing. As I say, we work across senior and youth tournaments as well. So we're trying to think a bit more around kind of the overarching development of the game. So in the women's game, for example, which is obviously a little bit more developing at the moment, you've got data for under 17 World Cup, under 20 World Cup, the senior World Cup. So we can look at what the differences are between those kind of longitudinal basis and try and help, for example, the FIFA women's football team, football performance team think about the development of the women's game, for example.
So because when you joined FIFA, again, just on your profile, Rob, so you joined it was football project manager. Now you are football data insights analyst. So what's the difference there then? What were you doing before and that's different to what you're doing now?
Yeah. So I originally joined. So Chris Loxton, who you had on the podcast before, was in charge of the project in the early days. So he brought me in initially to head up the data collection team. So I think as he talked about at the time, FIFA collects their own data, have a large team of analysts collecting the information. My role at the time was to come in and get that operational. They just literally in the days before I joined, they just kind of captured the data for their first tournament. And in the build up to the 2022 World Cup, my role really at the beginning was to come in and try and help structure that and make sure that the data collection process was working as intended and that the data was passed over to the data science team to be turned into the various outputs that were being used at the time for the teams, for internal analysis, etc. So I did that up until the end of 2021. And then there was kind of realization that nobody was using the data that we had internally. It was quite a good skill set of mine, so I kind of moved across into that role ahead of the World Cup to start actually making use of the data and try and support the various different areas of FIFA with that data as well. So that's what I've been doing for a while. We're now kind of moving. My focus now, I'm now kind of moving more towards using Python for a lot of data analysis. So that's kind of been a lot of my focus in the last year or so, has been starting to upskill myself on that tool and kind of how to use that and kind of move away from some of the tools I've used previously, because that's kind of again, we've got a very well established team. They're all very competent Python users. I'm sure many more tools as well. So trying to kind of align myself and fit inside those processes as well. So it's been a really good learning environment for me the past year or so as well.
Yeah, well, that's important, like for people to know, like someone that is a senior analyst at FIFA and you are still learning new skills. So it's it's important to keep up with different trends and learn new things all the time. So yeah, that's good to hear. Rob.
Every day is a school day.
So you mentioned obviously I had Chris Loxton on before. I'm going to link that below. That kind of links to the kind of capture of data, because on your profile, Rob, it says here like around 15,000 data points per match, which sounds unreal to be honest in terms of how much is actually being collected. So is that linked to the kind of the FIFA football language? But I also want to ask you really in terms of that's a lot of collection from a lot of analysts, and I suppose you were kind of overseeing that. So how much of a task was that in terms of accuracy, reliability, but also training the new analysts as well? Like lots of people, because I remember at the time obviously lots of new analysts came in, so obviously they've got to be trained to a high standard. How did that look for you, Rob?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. As you say, it's a big challenge. Yeah, so the original team had already been hired when I started, but in order to support tournaments where quite often we'll have up to 4 matches a day, it doesn't take long to do the maths. When Chris talked about us having one analyst coding 1 player per match, you need more than you need a lot of people basically to be able to capture that data. So yeah, in kind of late 2021, we did our first recruitment process for tournament football analysts. So one of the really good things, and again, Chris touches on this really nicely in the podcast you did before. One of the really nice things we've been able to do is give opportunities to people in the analysis world as well. So we've been able to bring people in on a temporary basis, teach them the FIFA football language. And if, again, Chris touches on that, but if anyone's not aware of what the FIFA football language is, it's essentially our data dictionary of football. So you can look it up on fifatrainingcenter.com. There's a link there to FIFA football language. Essentially, the team went through every metric that we capture, thought about how it should be defined, with our kind of overarching goal to try and help standardize some of those definitions across various different providers and across the football world. And one of the roles that Tom performs as head of the team is to try and liaise with different data providers in terms of the standards. So a really good example is our technology team. It's a different team to the one that I'm working in, but our technology team was involved in setting tracking data standards so that they are standardized across various different providers. And we kind of hope to do a similar thing around the data side as well. So we have our FIFA football language with all of our different metrics. The team are very well established now. We've been through many tournaments now, so they're very well established in terms of training, and it's something that the data collection team have got down to a really good process now. But yeah, bringing various different people in, trying to teach them the different areas of the language. So some of that or a lot of it is video based. This is an offer. So one of the things that we do is offering to receive, which is not something you often see in most data sources. So we will show them lots of examples and teach them the exact definition of what an offer to receive is, so that they are then able to capture that data. We then have various tools and methods to be able to then check the reliability across different analysts, make sure they're all seeing the same thing and make sure they're seeing what we think they should be seeing as well. So yeah, it's a never-ending task, I would say, in terms of maintaining that data quality. It's something we pride ourselves on being one of the best in the business, if not the best in the business in terms of our data quality as well. So it's something we put a lot of focus into in terms of trying to make sure everything we put out is the very best that it can be and to the highest quality. Some things will always be subjective because football is by its nature a very subjective game, but we try to narrow that subjectivity down to as smaller a gap as possible.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, like you mentioned, I'll link that down below for anyone that wants to hear from Chris as well, because that's also on that topic. So you mentioned the training center there, Rob. So just what is that basically? What can people find on there? And yeah, because we'll link that below as well.
Yeah, sure. So that kind of came about when Arsene Wenger joined FIFA back again, just before COVID. So back end of 2019, I think he came in as kind of head of global football development with a remit really to help try and improve the game across the world. And try and make it as competitive as possible. I think everyone wants to see the most competitive football they can. So the FIFA Training Center is our mouthpiece essentially. So it hosts the football language, for example. It hosts all of our tournament observations. So people may be familiar with kind of technical reports that you used to see at the end of European Championships, World Cup, Champions Leagues. FIFA used to put one of those together as well. We now tend to focus more on articles. So we'll put tactical articles out during tournaments. We'll do group stage reviews at the end of each group stage of tournaments. So just recently we had, as I mentioned, the Women's Under-20 World Cup in Colombia. We also had the Futsal World Cup that took place in Uzbekistan as well. Again, it's something we have spent a lot of time working on as well. So trying to put together a kind of FIFA football language like for the futsal world, because I think there's probably a lot of similarities you can take from futsal that you can take into football. I watched quite a few of the matches. It's quite exciting, to be fair. It's really good. It's a really good sport. And as I say, there's a lot you can take out of that as well. So yeah, so we put our articles on there. We also, it's kind of like, again, Chris touched on this, it's kind of like a circular economy in some respects. So we will capture the data on what we're seeing at the very elite levels of the game, whether that's elite youth or elite seniors, and we'll try and identify what are the key trends we're seeing there. We then use our talent team within FIFA as well to be able to turn that into coaching exercises, whether that's at the grassroots or again at elite youth or elite seniors. So you can go on there and find plenty of examples of coaching sessions. So you can imagine it came in very handy when I was doing my UEFA B license as well, in terms of being able to find those coaching tips. But for any coaches out there, you can go on there, and if you want to teach your players how to carry the ball, how to take someone on, you'll be able to go and find some really good examples of how to do that. We have an Instagram page as well that often shows some clips and again links through to that. So again, it's trying to share best practices with the world, really. So yeah, it's essentially the kind of mouthpiece of the global football development team, but is a really positive example.
Nice, yeah. So that's a cool resource. I'll link that down below. I also only recently even found out about the FIFA Plus, where there's games on there. You can stream games, which for people that are looking to get into scouting, especially, there's load. Liam Henshaw mentioned it last time in terms of go on there. There's a load of games from around the world that you can watch on demand or even live. So yeah, that's really cool as well. So What we'll touch on now, Rob, quickly is kind of a bit of advice for people. So I'm presuming, or I might be wrong here, but have you been part of the hiring process for analysts? And have you been on the interview process at all? Or?
I was, yeah, as I say, for that year that I was in charge of the team, I was involved in the recruitment process for some of the analysts there. Yeah.
Yeah. So around that, really, in terms of those looking to get in, other than the technical skills, what kind of other things would you look for if you are hiring a data analyst, let's say?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I think it's fair to say some of the processes probably developed over time, but at the time we essentially were looking for people who could understand the concepts of the FIFA football language. So one of the tasks we presented, for example, was at the time it wasn't on the FIFA training center, but here was an element of the language. Here are some of the definitions, and here are, let's say, 25 clips. Can you go through and identify situations? And it was a little bit of a trick because some of them contained some of them didn't.
Yeah.
So we were really looking for people to really read what we said and kind of take that on board. So try and understand that definitions. And then to be able to go and use their football understanding. We picked probably one of the most subjective elements of our language to make it as difficult as possible, because we really wanted to test their football expertise. Yeah, we want people who are collecting our data to really understand the game. They're not just data collection experts sat there just working through stuff. They are people who worked in football who have really good understanding of football. So can they go through these clips and identify situations? Can they also have the courage within themselves to understand that sometimes those situations aren't there? And therefore, can they say, actually, I don't think there was anything there?
Yeah.
We would then, first of all, we would look at the results, and that would give you a relatively good indication. We kind of knew what we were looking for, but again, it was kind of a show your workings kind of thing. So when we got onto interviews with people, we would ask them to run through clips and explain. Some of the examples we gave them, we might not even be able to agree amongst ourselves within FIFA what those were. So we were really looking for people to try and give some explanations as well. So yeah, we had a big exercise supported by some of the universities. Because again, when you're looking for a lot of people, they were always a really good resource and really good to kind of link in with those. So we kind of leveraged that relationship to try and help bring some people in. I've lost count of how many different people have been tournament football analysts over the years, but there must be, into triple figures at least, a number of people who've come and had opportunities to do that, and some fantastic people. Some of them have got full-time jobs with FIFA previously as well. One of them is in the team I'm working in now as well. For example, I hired him a couple of years ago as a tournament analyst, and he's now with us on a full-time basis as well. So it's been really good to give opportunities to people in the team. And again, I think Chris touched on that really nicely at the time as kind of one of the things that the team wanted to do when they set up.
I just wanted to ask you as well about, just going back to that point you said when you've kind of been learning Python, Rob, how have you been learning that? Is there any resources you can maybe share, or how do you go about learning a new skill?
Yeah, so for me, I think it depends on different people. Some people will just pick it up naturally. Some people will be able to go and look at some code and be like, oh yeah, I understand that. That's definitely not me. It's definitely not me. I'm not a computer programmer. I did not have a computer when I was a child until I was probably 14, 15. And even then, it really was only like a word processor. So I didn't really have that much of an understanding when I was younger, whereas these days, I've got young children myself. I'm trying to help them understand kind of computer programming skills already, and one of them's only 5. So it's definitely a bit better understanding these days. But for me, is going and finding resources. So, for example, I use DataCamp, which is a really good website. You can sign on. It's like you pay like an annual subscription. Essentially, I think it's like £150 or something. So it's not bad in the grand scheme of things. And you get access to various different courses on various different tools. They have some that are set out on what they call tracks. So like, for example, one of them is a data scientist professional track. So you want to go and work in a company as a data scientist, you can work through this track. It will teach you how to use, for example, in Python, how to use different packages, how to load data, how to use pandas, for example, which is one of the main kind of packages for interrogating data, how to do data visualizations, and then onwards to kind of how to do more predictive modeling, for example, which is a little bit outside the scope and let's say what I'm interested in. So I can skip through those bits. You can also go and find lots of modules on there as well on various things. So some of them are just kind of one-off modules. So if you want to learn about a data visualization package called Dash, for example, they've got a little module, a little short course on there, and they're like 3 hours long, 4 hours long, most of these courses. They're delivered across little videos and then little kind of online tests where you actually get to apply yourself. Actually kind of work through some tasks. So personally, I found that really useful because again, it's video based. I'm going through there, seeing what they're showing me, and then they're actually asking me to kind of put that into practice. And more often than not, when I'm doing that, they take me forever to do, because I'm then jumping in thinking, oh, I can make use of that on this, or go and use some of that. So I've used that, but there's lots of great resources out there. Jamie Dos Anjos, who runs FC Python, has got some really, really good, tasks and stuff on his website as well. So definitely check that out. At the moment, Mackay Johns, who has a YouTube page and Twitter page, is definitely my best friend. I'm using a lot of stuff of his. He puts out some really, really good resources and explainers. Again, he runs some courses, I think, across SQL and Python, for example, but again, we'll quite often put out some examples of how to do stuff. He put something up a few weeks ago about how to create visualizations that look as smart as The Athletic, for example, or Opta, and I've definitely been leveraging some of those recently as well, some of those skills. So again, trying to look for what's out there. There's lots of things out there for free or for low cost. Or again, if you're able to afford it, there are online courses you can go and do. There are in-person courses you can go and do, but more often than not, most people are doing this kind of either in their spare time or limited time within work. So I find Data Camp myself really, really useful, because I'm able to go and jump in and take little chunks and work through those. So it's been really good. Not quite there, but I'm getting there.
Perfect, nice. McKay's also been on this podcast as well.
Yes.
So I'll link down anyone that wants to learn Python or any other similar tool. He's got a load of really cool, easy to follow walkthroughs as well. So definitely worth checking them out. So I always ask people at the end, Rob, any recommendations, any books, podcasts? Are you a reader? It doesn't have to be sports analysis. It can be anything that you take a fancy to.
I am, yeah. For anyone watching this video, you can probably see all the books behind me. Those ones are mostly my sports books. Yeah, there's a couple that I really like. So at the moment, I'm reading The Daily Stoic, which is a book that kind of gives Stoic advice on like a daily basis. I think I'm in April at the moment, which probably says a lot about. I started on the 1st of January with great intentions, but
I've got that behind me. I've not read it yet, right? It's on mine.
It's really good. It's just a nice way of working through it. It just kind of gives you little tips on kind of values that you want to uphold and stuff. I think they're things that I find personally useful as a parent, as well as someone kind of working in kind of high performance environment. So I really like that. There's also a couple of really good old books. Lots of people have touched on the numbers game before. I still personally think that's probably the Bible, like in terms of sports analysis, sports analytics. A lot of stuff is still valuable there. And there's also, again, another book from around the same time called, it is called Sports Analytics by Ben Alamar. It's a very practical guide to setting up a sports analytics environment. And again, it was probably written 10, 15 years ago, but I think in most cases is very, very relevant as well. So I definitely recommend that book to anyone who's kind of starting out in kind of sports analytics and thinking about how to set things up. It's a really good book, and he's again, is a really good guy.
Perfect. So I'm going to link the books down below. I'm going to link a few of the episodes, the FIFA Training Center, everything we've spoke about, anything that's worth linking, they'll be down below. If anyone has any questions, obviously leave them in a comment below. I'm sure I'll try and pass them over to you, Rob, if you can. But yeah, anything else you want to give a shout out to, Rob? That's everything.
You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn at Rob Suddaby. I'm not on Twitter much these days, but you can always drop me a message on there if you want to chat at some point. Hopefully get to a few more conferences at some point over the next year as well, and try and get back out and meet people in the wild. So yeah, give me a shout if you'd like to chat.
Perfect. Well, Rob, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate that, and hopefully, catch up soon.
Thanks so much, Chris. Take care.
Cheers.